The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and Thomas Pritchard's fire had been dead for 6 hours when Matthias Kohler broke through the snowdrift, blocking the cabin door. Inside, his trapping partner sat frozen against the far wall, still clutching the empty tinderbox he'd tried desperately to relight before the cold had taken him. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. Matthias Kohler had been checking his trap lines along the eastern ridge when the wind shifted. That was February 12, 1871, in what is now northwestern Wyoming, and the temperature had been dropping steadily since dawn. He had left Thomas Pritchard at their cabin that morning with instructions to keep the fire strong and the coffee hot. The trap lines were only 3 miles out, an easy circuit that should have taken 4 hours at most. But the wind had other plans. By midday, the cold had become serious. By 2 in the afternoon, it had become dangerous. Matthias abandoned the last section of his line and headed back, moving fast through snow that was already drifting across his morning tracks. The sky had that flat gray quality that promised worse weather coming. He reached the cabin just before dark, pushing through a snowdrift that had built against the door since morning. The silence inside told him everything before his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Thomas sat against the far wall near the stone fireplace, his body rigid in the position he had died in. The fire pit was nothing but cold ash. The cabin interior felt like the inside of a tomb, the air so cold that Matthias could see his breath in thick clouds. Thomas's hands were still wrapped around the tinderbox, his fingers frozen in the act of trying to create spark. Around him on the floor lay scattered pieces of kindling, a few damp wood chips, and the leather pouch that had held their emergency tinder supply. Matthias stood in the doorway for a long time, trying to understand what had happened. Thomas Pritchard was not a careless man. He had survived 4 winters in these mountains. He knew how to maintain a fire. He knew the cost of letting it die. But as Matthias moved closer and began examining the scene, the story became clear. The firewood stack near the hearth was empty. Not low, empty. The larger woodpile was outside, and at some point during the day, the weather had turned so severe that leaving the cabin had become impossible. Thomas had burned everything within reach, every stick of kindling, every piece of split wood stored inside. He had probably tried to make the fire last, rationing the wood, hoping the weather would break enough for him to dash outside for more. It had not broken. And when the last piece of wood had burned down to ash, Thomas had tried to restart the fire using the emergency tinder and the few damp scraps he could find. The tinderbox showed multiple strike marks. He had tried again and again. In cold that severe, with damp materials and failing light, he had not succeeded. Matthias buried his partner 3 days later when the weather finally cleared. He chose a spot on the hillside overlooking the valley where they had trapped together. He marked the grave with stones and stood there until the cold drove him back inside. That night, alone in the cabin with a roaring fire that he fed constantly, Matthias began thinking about a problem that would consume him for the next year. Fires go out, and when they do, in cold severe enough, there is no second chance. Matthias continued trapping through the rest of that winter, but his heart was no longer in the work. The beaver ponds and trap lines that had once commanded his full attention now felt like distractions from a larger question that occupied his mind during every waking hour. How did you build a fire that could not die? He began visiting other trappers' camps whenever his route brought him near their cabins. He would arrive with some excuse, a borrowed tool to return or information about game movements to share, but his real purpose was always the same. He studied their fireplaces. He examined how they built their hearths, where they positioned their chimneys, how they stored their wood. He asked questions that probably seemed strange to men who had never lost a partner to cold. Most mountain cabins used variations of the same basic design: a stone or mud fireplace built against one wall, a chimney rising through the roof, an open hearth where the fire burned. The design was simple because simplicity was all that frontier conditions allowed. You gathered stones from a creek bed. You stacked them with mud mortar. You cut a hole in your roof for smoke to escape. It worked adequately when it worked. When it failed catastrophically. Matthias talked to a trapper named William Vandermeer, who had survived a close call the previous winter. Dutch, as everyone called him, had been snowed in for 5 days during a storm. He had rationed his interior wood supply carefully, but on the 4th day his fire had gone out while he slept. He had woken to a cabin so cold that ice had formed on the interior walls. He had managed to restart the fire using his emergency tinder and the last scraps of bark he could peel from the cabin logs themselves. But it had been close. Another trapper, Luther Grimes, told Matthias about losing a fire during a 3-day blow. Luther had been forced to burn one of his wooden chairs, then part of his sleeping platform, then finally sections of his doorframe before the weather cleared. He had survived by destroying the shelter that protected him. The pattern was consistent. Fires required constant feeding. Chimneys drew heat upward and out of the living space. Open hearths were exposed to drafts that could extinguish flames. Interior wood supplies were always limited, and blizzards could trap a man inside for days with no way to replenish fuel. The standard solutions were obvious and inadequate. Keep more wood inside, store better tinder, build a larger hearth. But these only delayed the fundamental problem. A fire burning in open air, drawing oxygen freely and exhausting heat through a chimney, consumed fuel rapidly and required constant attention. When fuel or attention failed, it died. Matthias became fixated on a different question. What if the fire itself could be redesigned? Not the fuel or the storage, but the actual structure of combustion. What if you could build a fire that burned slower, retained heat longer, and survived periods of neglect that would kill a normal fire? Most trappers dismissed such thinking. Fire was fire. It behaved according to natural laws. No construction could change. But Matthias kept thinking about Thomas. The cold ash, the desperate kindling scatter, the frozen hands gripping the tinderbox. There had to be a better way. By spring, Matthias had decided. He would take his furs to Street Lewis, but this year he would not spend time in saloons. He would study buildings. He would find men who understood construction and heat. He would learn everything about how structures contained warmth. Then he would return and build something never built before. A fire that could not die. Matthias arrived in Street Lewis in early June of 1871 with $270 from his fur sales and a notebook he had purchased specifically for recording observations. Other trappers spent their town time drinking and gambling. Matthias spent his walking through the city studying buildings with the intensity of a man whose life depended on what he learned. He started in the German district where bakeries operated day and night. He watched bakers slide loaves into massive brick ovens, then seal the iron doors. Hours later, long after the fires inside had been reduced to ash, the ovens still radiated enough heat to bake bread. The bakers explained that the brick absorbed heat during firing, then released it slowly over time. The thicker the brick walls, the longer the heat lasted. Some ovens stayed warm enough to work with for 12 hours after the last flame died. Matthias filled pages with sketches, brick thickness, door seal designs, the way heat moved through mass rather than air. He began understanding that fire and heat were separate things. Fire was combustion that could be extinguished. Heat was energy that could be captured and stored in materials dense enough to hold it. He found a blacksmith's forge near the riverfront and spent 3 days watching the smith work. The forge used a stone hearth surrounded by fire brick. When the smith finished for the day, he would bank the coals, covering them with ash and reducing airflow. The next morning, those coals would still be alive, glowing red when he cleared the ash away. The smith explained that limiting oxygen slowed combustion, without extinguishing it. A coal bed properly banked could survive overnight with no attention. Matthias wrote everything down: reduced oxygen, covered coals, controlled airflow. These were principles that could be applied. On his 8th day in the city, he met old Pierre Durand in a tavern near the French Market. Pierre was a retired trapper who had spent his later years working as a stonemason. He was 72 years old, missing 3 fingers from his left hand, and full of stories about building techniques he had learned from a French engineer decades earlier. Pierre described hypocaust systems used in ancient Roman buildings. Fires burned in underground chambers beneath living spaces. Heat rose through the floor rather than escaping through chimneys. The floors themselves became radiating surfaces that warmed rooms evenly. Pierre had never built a full hypocaust, but he understood the principle: heat below, not beside, mass around the fire to capture it. Minimal heat loss too, open air. Matthias bought Pierre drinks for 3 hours and covered his notebook pages with diagrams. Underground fire chambers, stone-lined pits, floor-level heat distribution. Pierre explained how to cut stones to fit curves, how to mortar them for heat resistance, how to calculate chamber volumes for proper combustion. Before leaving street, Louis, Matthias, spent his remaining money on supplies other trappers would have considered insane. Stone-cutting chisels. A copper dome he commissioned from a metalworker, specifying exact dimensions and rivet reinforcement. Clay and lime for heat-resistant mortar. He arranged transport to the mountain territories and prepared to return. He had learned what he needed. Now he had to build it. Matthias returned to the mountains in late July of 1871 with a pack train that raised eyebrows at every trading post along the route. Most trappers hauled powder, lead, coffee, and salt. Matthias hauled stone-cutting tools, a custom copper dome that weighed 40 pounds, bags of clay and lime, and specialized chisels wrapped in oiled canvas. When Luther Grimes saw him unloading at the final outpost, he laughed out loud. "You hauled rocks in a cookpot lid all the way from Street Louis? Kohler, grief's made you useless." Matthias said nothing. He paid for transport of his supplies to a staging area near his old trap lines, then spent 2 days moving everything to a new location he had selected 3 miles from where Thomas had died. He would not rebuild on that site. Some places carried too much weight. The new location sat on high ground, with clear sight lines in 3 directions and a creek 200 yards downslope. Most trappers built near water for convenience. Matthias chose elevation for visibility and drainage. If snowmelt created flooding, his cabin would be above it. If weather approached, he would see it coming. He spent the next 2 weeks doing something that would have seemed pointless to any observer. He sat on down, a flat rock, with his notebook and sketched plans. He calculated dimensions. He drew the same circular design dozens of times, adjusting diameter, depth, and stone thickness with each iteration. He was designing something that did not exist, using principles he had learned from bakers and blacksmiths and an old French-Canadian mason. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it would either work or kill him. The design centered on a circular pit, 3 feet deep, 4 feet across at the bottom, tapering to 3 feet at floor level. Stone-lined completely, creating an underground combustion chamber surrounded by thermal mass. Above the floor, a visible ring of curved stone forming the fire chamber. At floor level, thick squared blocks creating a protective rim between wood and fire, and covering everything, the copper dome that would restrict airflow and transform open fire into controlled smoldering. Luther visited again in mid-August, found Matthias still sketching, and could not contain himself. "You planning to dig for gold? Build a well? Because that ain't no fireplace you're drawing." "It's a fire pit," Matthias said. "Goes under the floor." Luther stared at him. "Under your floor, your wood floor. You're gonna burn a fire inside your cabin floor. The stone will protect the wood. Stone cracks in heat. Wood burns. You're describing a coffin that lights itself." Luther shook his head. "Grief mad. I told Dutch you'd gone grief mad." After Luther left, Matthias continued planning. He knew how it sounded. A fire burning below a wooden floor violated every principle of safe construction. But he had seen brick ovens hold heat for half a day. He had watched coal beds survive overnight under ash. He understood that controlled fire in enclosed stone was different from open flame on a hearth. He would prove it by building it, starting tomorrow. Matthias began excavation on August 15, 1871. He selected a spot that would become the center of his cabin, marked a circle 3 feet in diameter on the ground, and started digging. The work was slow. The soil was dense with rocks and roots from trees that had stood there decades earlier. He dug carefully, keeping the walls of the pit as vertical as possible, widening the bottom to 4 feet across while maintaining the narrower opening at ground level. 3 days of digging brought him to a depth of 3 feet. He cleared the bottom flat and began the next phase, stone selection. He spent an entire week walking the creek beds and hillsides within a mile of his site, examining every rock for size, shape, and material. He rejected porous sandstone that would crumble under heat. He rejected river stones with cracks or fissures. He selected dense granite and limestone, pieces that ranged from the size of his fist to the size of his head, looking for stones that could be shaped and fitted. He hauled rocks back to his site in a canvas sling, making dozens of trips until he had gathered more stone than he thought he would need. Then he began the painstaking work of building the underground chamber. He started at the bottom of the pit, laying the largest, flattest stones as a foundation. He mixed his mortar according to the proportions old Pierre had taught him. 3 parts clay to 1 part lime, with water added until the mixture held shape but remained workable. Each stone was fitted individually. He would place it, check the fit against its neighbors, remove it, shape it with his chisels if necessary, apply mortar, and set it again. The bottom layer took 2 full days. The walls rose slowly, curving inward slightly as they climbed toward ground level. He was creating a bell shape, wider at the bottom than at the top, maximizing the volume of stone that would surround the fire. The work required precision he had never needed as a trapper. Every stone had to support the weight above it. Every joint had to be tight enough to prevent mortar from crumbling. Every surface had to be positioned to reflect heat inward rather than allowing it to escape through gaps. He worked from dawn until dark, and some days he completed only 6 inches of vertical progress. By mid-September, the underground chamber was complete. The stonework rose from the pit bottom to ground level, creating a circular column of fitted rock. Above ground level, he continued building, creating the visible fire chamber that would sit inside his cabin floor. He shaped stones to maintain the curve, building a ring 18 inches high. The interior diameter at floor level was exactly 3 feet. The final element of this phase was critical. He cut thick stone blocks into squares, each one 6 inches on a side and 3 inches thick. These would form the protective rim at floor level, the barrier between his wooden cabin and the fire below. He fitted 12 blocks in a perfect circle, mortaring them in place, creating a raised collar that would be the last defense against disaster. With the stone chamber complete, Matthias faced the phase that separated his design from madness. He had to build a wooden cabin floor around an open fire pit without creating the very disaster Thomas had died from. The squared stone rim was his answer, but proving it would work required testing that made his hands shake. He began cabin construction in late September. 4 walls of notched logs, carefully fitted and chinked with moss and clay. The structure was small, 16 feet by 14 feet, with the stone fire chamber positioned off-center to allow floor space for living. He built the walls to a height of 7 feet, installed a simple peaked roof with split shingle covering, and cut a door and single window. The cabin itself was unremarkable. What came next was not. He cut floor planks from straight pine logs, hewing one side flat and leaving the other rounded. Each plank was 10 inches wide and 12 feet long. Laying a floor was simple work that any trapper could finish in a day. Laying a floor around a fire pit required mathematics and nerve. He measured the distance from each wall to the stone rim, calculating angles and cuts. The planks would run parallel to the long walls, which meant some would need to be cut in curves to fit around the circular stone rim. He did not own a saw capable of cutting curves. He used his axe and draw knife, shaping each board edge by hand until it matched the circle's arc. The work took 6 days. When he finally began laying the planks, starting from the walls and working inward, he left the area around the fire pit for last. The final planks were the shortest, spanning from the wall to the squared stone rim. Each one ended exactly at the edge of those protective blocks. The rim stones sat 3 inches above the floor level. Matthias had designed this intentionally. The raised edge would prevent coals from rolling onto the wood. It would create a physical barrier that kept the floor itself slightly separated from direct fire exposure. And it would provide thermal mass that absorbed heat before it could reach combustible material. Before considering the floor complete, Matthias conducted a test that Luther would later call suicidal. He built a fire in the stone chamber, not a small test fire, but a full blaze using dry pine that burned hot and fast. He let it rage for 2 hours, feeding it constantly, creating more heat than any normal fire would generate. Then he placed his hand on the squared rim stones. They were warm, not hot enough to burn. Warm like sun-heated rock. He touched the wooden floor planks nearest the rim. They were barely above air temperature. The 3-inch gap, the mass of the stone, and the design of the chamber were working exactly as he had calculated. He let the fire burn down to coals, monitoring the floor temperature every hour. The wood never grew hot enough to char. When he finally allowed the fire to die completely, he examined every inch of floor near the pit. No. Scorching. No discoloration. No failure. The impossible was possible. Matthias retrieved the copper dome from where he had stored it, wrapped in canvas beneath a tarp. The metalworker in street, Louis, had followed his specifications exactly. The dome measured 3 feet across at the base, rising to a shallow peak of 6 inches at the center. Its surface was covered in rows of round rivets, reinforcement that prevented warping under repeated heating and cooling. A sturdy U-shaped handle rose from the top, and 2 iron loops were mounted on opposite sides near the base for emergency handling if the dome became too hot to lift by the center grip. He had paid $17 for this piece, nearly a tenth of his entire fur sale proceeds. Luther had called it the most expensive pot lid in the Rocky Mountains. But Matthias understood it was the key to everything. Without the dome, he simply had an unusual fireplace. With it, he had a system that could control combustion itself. On October 3, 1871, he built his first fire in the completed pit. He started small with kindling and dry pine shavings, letting the fire establish itself in the center of the stone chamber. As flames grew, he added larger pieces, building up to split logs he had prepared specifically for this purpose. He let the fire burn openly for an hour, watching how it behaved in the circular stone enclosure. Heat radiated evenly. Smoke rose straight up. The stones grew warm to the touch. Then he lifted the copper dome and placed it over the opening. It seated perfectly on the squared rim stones, the dome's edge overlapping the blocks by 2 inches on all sides. He had deliberately not designed it to seal completely. A small gap remained around the entire circumference, perhaps a 1/4 inch, enough to allow minimal airflow. The effect was immediate. The flames visible through the gap diminished. The fire's roar quieted to a whisper. Matthias watched through the narrow space as the combustion transformed. Flames shrank toward the coal bed. The wood continued burning, but slowly, starved of the oxygen that had fed the open fire. Within 10 minutes, the fire had reduced to glowing coals that pulsed gently with each breath of air that found its way under the dome's edge. He left it sealed. 1 hour passed, 2 hours, 3. He lifted the dome briefly at the 3-hour mark and looked inside. The coals were still alive, glowing red-orange in the dimness. He added a single piece of split wood. The coals ignited it immediately. Flames rose again. He replaced the dome and watched the fire settle back into its controlled smolder. That night, he sealed the fire pit before sleeping. He had built a coal bed 6 inches deep, placed the dome, and gone to his sleeping platform with more anxiety than he had felt in years. If he was wrong about oxygen flow, the fire would die. If he was wrong about the wood floor, he would wake to flames or not wake at all. He woke to a warm cabin and smoke curling from beneath the dome's edge. The fire had survived the night. Matthias spent the winter of 1871 through 1872 living alone in his cabin, testing his fire pit system under conditions that would reveal any fatal flaw. November brought the first serious cold, temperatures dropping below zero for days at a time. December brought snow that buried the landscape under 3 feet of white. January brought winds that screamed down from the peaks and made every cabin wall shudder. Through it all, the fire never died. He learned the system's rhythms through careful observation and constant notes in his journal. A coal bed 4 inches deep could sustain sealed combustion for 18 hours. A coal bed 6 inches deep could last a full day. If he built the bed to 8 inches, carefully layering hardwood coals in the bottom of the stone chamber, the fire could survive 36 hours with the dome sealed and no attention whatsoever. He discovered that wood positioning mattered enormously. When he laid split logs horizontally across the coals, they burned faster and less efficiently. When he stood them vertically, leaning against the curved stone wall, they burned from the top down, feeding the coal bed gradually as the upper sections turned to ember and collapsed. This vertical stacking method, combined with the restricted oxygen from the dome, created combustion that was almost meditative in its steadiness. The floor became a radiant heating surface exactly as he had envisioned. On cold mornings, he could walk barefoot across the planks near the fire pit and feel warmth rising through the wood. The heat distributed evenly because it came from below rather than radiating from a single point on a wall. His cabin stayed warmer than any trapper shelter he had ever inhabited, and he used less wood to achieve it because the stone chamber captured and held heat that would have escaped up a chimney. He refined his technique through the months. He learned which woods produced the longest-lasting coals. Oak and maple were superior to pine. Ash burned clean and left substantial ember beds. He learned that opening the dome twice daily, once in morning and once in evening, allowed him to maintain optimal conditions while using minimal fuel. Each opening required only minutes. He would lift the dome, assess the coal bed, add 1 or 2 pieces of wood if needed, and reseal. In mid-January, a cold snap drove temperatures to 25 below zero for 4 consecutive days. Matthias deliberately tested his system's limits. He built a coal bed 8 inches deep, sealed the dome, and left the fire unattended for 4 full days. He did not open the pit. He did not add wood. He simply lived in the cabin, monitoring the floor temperature and trusting his design. On the 4th day, he lifted the dome. The coal bed had diminished to 2 inches, but it was still alive, still glowing, still producing heat. He added 3 pieces of wood. The fire resurrected as though it had never been neglected. When William Vandermeer visited in late January and saw the sealed fire pit keeping Matthias's cabin warm, he stopped laughing about the crazy German who built fires in his floor. The storm arrived on February 7, 1872, with a wind that sounded like freight trains colliding in the sky. Matthias had seen the signs 2 days earlier: the strange stillness, the yellow-gray clouds building on the western horizon, the way his breath hung in air that felt too heavy. He had prepared by splitting extra wood, stacking it inside along the cabin walls, and building his coal bed to maximum depth. By the time the first snow began falling, he had 8 inches of glowing coals in the stone chamber and the copper dome sealed tight. The blizzard hit with a ferocity that erased the landscape. Snow fell so thick that Matthias could not see the tree line 50 yards from his cabin. Wind drove the snow horizontal, building drifts that climbed his walls and buried his window. The temperature plunged: 20 below, 25 below, 30 below. The cold was the kind that killed exposed flesh in minutes and made breathing painful. Matthias stayed inside. He had no choice. Opening the door would have meant death. The wind would have torn it from his hands. The cold would have dropped him before he covered 10 feet. He was trapped in his cabin with whatever resources existed within those walls. For most trappers, that situation was a death sentence waiting to be executed. Fire required wood. Wood was outside. Eventually, the interior supply ran out, but Matthias had built something different. He opened his fire pit once on the first day of the storm, adding 2 pieces of wood to the coal bed. He opened it once on the second day, adding 1 piece. On the 3rd day, with the storm still raging and visibility still 0, he did not open it at all. The sealed dome maintained. combustion at a rate so slow that the coals simply glowed and waited, producing steady heat that radiated through the stone and into the floor. The cabin stayed warm enough that he never needed his heavy coat inside. The floor remained comfortable to walk on without boots. On the fourth day, the wind finally broke. The snow stopped. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp it hurt to look at. Matthias opened his door and climbed out onto drifts that had buried his cabin to the roofline on the north side. He dug out his woodpile and stood in air so cold his beard froze solid within seconds. Then he went to check on his neighbors. Luther Grimes's cabin was 3 miles south. Matthias found Luther alive, but barely. His fire had died on the second night when his interior wood supply ran out. He had burned 1 chair, part of his table, and 3 planks from his sleeping platform before the storm cleared enough for him to reach his outdoor pile. He had survived, but his hands showed early, frostbite, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had felt death approaching. William Vandermeer had fared better, but only because he had started with more wood inside. He had burned everything within reach, and his fire had died on the 3rd morning. He had spent the final day and night in his coldest clothes, wrapped in every blanket he owned, waiting. 2 trappers 15 miles east were found dead a week later when the snow melted enough for travel. Their fires had gone out. They had frozen. Spring arrived late in 1872, the snow lingering into April as though reluctant to release its grip on the mountains. When the trappers finally emerged from their winter isolation and began visiting each other's camps, the story of the blizzard of '72 dominated every conversation. Men compared how long their fires had lasted, how much interior wood they had burned, how close they had come to freezing, and every conversation eventually turned to the same question. How had Matthias Kohler kept his fire alive for 4 days without leaving his cabin? Luther Grimes was the first to ask directly. He arrived at Matthias's cabin in mid-April, examined the circular stone-lined pit with the copper dome sitting beside it, and asked for an explanation of everything. Matthias walked him through the design. The underground stone chamber that stored heat, the squared rim that protected the wooden floor, the dome that restricted oxygen and transformed open flame into controlled smoldering, the vertical wood stacking that created top-down combustion. Luther listened, took notes, and asked if Matthias would help him build one. By summer, 3 more trappers had visited and requested the same assistance. Matthias shared everything freely. He drew diagrams showing chamber dimensions. He explained Pierre Durand's stone-cutting techniques and mortar formulas. He described how to calculate dome size and why the rivet reinforcement mattered. He was not trying to profit from his innovation or claim credit for genius. He was simply sharing something that worked because other men needed it to survive. William Vandermeer built the second Kohler fire pit, as they were already being called, in July of 1872. He modified the design slightly, using river stone instead of quarried granite, and creating a dome from hammered iron rather than copper. The principles remained the same. By autumn, he reported that his system worked exactly as Matthias had promised. Over the next 3 years, sealed fire pit systems appeared in cabins throughout the northern Rockies. Some trappers built them exactly to Matthias's specifications. Others adapted the design based on available materials or personal preference. A few used square chambers instead of circular. Some built larger domes. One innovative trapper created a dual-chamber system with 2 small pits instead of 1 large one. But all of them shared the core principle. Fire contained in stone, heat stored in mass, combustion controlled by restricted airflow. The technique saved lives. In the winter of 1874, another severe storm trapped trappers in their cabins for 6 days. Those with sealed pit systems survived comfortably. Those with traditional hearths struggled or perished. Matthias continued trapping until 1876, then sold his equipment and headed west to Oregon Territory. He married a woman named Catherine in 1877. They had 4 children and operated a small ranch outside Salem. He died quietly in 1889 at age 56, never knowing how many men survived winters because of something he had built from grief and stone. But in the mountains, in abandoned cabins slowly reclaimed by forest, circular stone-lined pits remained, silent, empty, waiting. Testament to the man who refused to accept that fires must die.